Mr. Reed is in the waiting room. Miss Veal, are you here? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Do you have the ability to let Mr. Reed into the virtual courtroom?
He is now in.
Okay, great. Mr. Reed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, great. Mr. Patterson, are you ready to resume your cross-examination?
Your Honor, this is Mr. Thompson. I had thought Mr. Huff was on because I saw his box, but now I am not seeing him, so I apologize. I may have misspoken when I said we were all here, and perhaps someone on our team will text him immediately.
Yes, Your Honor, this is Nicole Moss with Legislative Defendants. He has contacted me and he's having a connection problem. So if you
I can hear you now. This is I'm sorry for the record. This is Nathan Huff at Phelps. For some reason, when it took me out of the private session and into here, it disconnected my video and audio, and so I'm working on that now, and I apologize profusely to the court for this, and I'm expecting to fix it here very shortly.
That's fine. I mistakenly called you Mr. Patterson.
I didn't even hear that yet, Your Honor, so you're off the hook there.
Okay.
One moment, please.
I can hear you fine, but I can't see you.
This is Nathan Huff. I'm just going to leave and come back in, and I suspect that will cure it. So I'm going to try that now. Thank you.
Okay.
Your Honor, this is Nicole Moss for the legislative defendants. I just want to let you know I'm on the phone with Mr. Huff, and he is trying this on a different computer. For some reason, it's just not letting him in. It's not even giving him the waiting room option, but he is trying again.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can't get on this computer or this computer, and I got the court waiting.
I think he's on and doesn't realize it, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe if I pop.
Here, whoops, sorry.
Or
So
is that through your phone?
I think that was through my phone. I'm sorry. Yes, I had called him to find out what the status is. He's trying it on 2 different computers, and for some reason, it's not the link that was sent around. He's going back through it, and it's just not letting him back in. And I, obviously don't quite know why.
I'll be honest with you, it's not that uncommon. I this morning before court, I actually I was on, and then I for whatever reason I came back out, and when I tried to get back on, it wouldn't let me on, and so I basically restarted my computer, and by restarting my computer and everything sort of coming up again, it then allowed me to join back. So
I will pass that on to him and see if that helps. I'll see if that helps out. All right. Let me.
Judge Poovey,
yes.
this is Kelly Myers. I just want to let you know, I just sent Mr. Huff an invite from within the WebEx meeting to his
Okay.
email. So hopefully that will work.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Nicole Moss again, Your Honor. He's going to both try shutting down his computer and then trying the new link that Ms. Myers just sent to see if those 2 things work. And we appreciate your your understanding.
Enjoy week 4.
I believe, Your Honor, he is now in the waiting room and has been able to reboot his computer and use the link that Ms. Myers was so kind to send to him.
Mr. Huff has been admitted. He should be in the room now.
Mr. Huff, can you hear me? I don't. I see his name as one of the people in the room, but I don't know that he can hear me. His microphone does not appear to be muted. Mr. Huff, can you hear me? Everybody else hear me? Okay, I get thumbs up. Mr. Reed, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. There he is.
Yes.
Hey,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
listen, don't think a thing more about it. The same thing kind of happened to me this morning, and I mentioned when we started this trial that we sort of expected there to be times like that, and so I doubt very seriously if this will be the last time somebody has technical issues getting on or whatnot. So just completely and totally, as best you can, just forget about it, and we'll go forward. Are you ready to proceed with your cross-examination of Mr. Reed?
Yeah, I'm ready, Your Honor. I'm flustered, but I'm ready.
You may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize again to all the parties. That was just a nuclear level fluke thing, and Mr. Reed, I apologize to you for taking up your time. So when we left off, we were talking about just the general timeline of your service on the board. And I think that we had worked out, I had initially misspoke and said August 18, but we figured out together that you started in April of 2018. And
Can I clarify?
Yeah, of course.
So Board of Elections members are nominated by their county party around the time of their county convention on odd number years. So if I'm renominated this time, it would be be the beginning of my third term. They're 2-year terms. As I've said, there was a lot of back and forth in the courts at the beginning of my first term. So but like I said, they are 2-year terms, and this would be, if I am renominated, this would be my third 2-year term.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. So in December of 18, the board disbands, right?
Yes, was that when they were combining the Board of Elections with the Ethics Committee? I think I may be wrong about that, but that was another issue besides the size of the boards.
And then you get reappointed in February of 19, correct?
Yes, odd number years.
Okay. And in between those two is when the law at issue in this case was enacted, SB 824, right?
If you say so, yes.
Okay, well maybe we'll go at it this way. When you got back or were reappointed for February 19, at that time, SB 824 was in effect.
I can't say for sure.
Okay, so you're not even sure back then if you were working on implementing 824 in February of 2019.
That would make sense since we had our machine in 2019. So yes.
Okay. And it was about 3 months later when you submitted your affidavit for this case, right? In May of 19?
That sounds correct.
All right. So at the time that you do that, you've had about a combined 12 months of experience on the Board of Elections.
Can you lay out those dates one more time for me?
Yeah, and I don't expect you to have the exact number. I just want to get in the ballpark. But if you go, if you started sometime around April 18 and you ran through December, that's around 9 months, right? And then if you go February to May,
Yes.
once you're reappointed in 19, that kind of gets you around a year, right?
Sounds right.
All right. And so for the first big chunk of that, the 2018 period of that, SB 824 was not yet in effect.
Right.
And eventually, whatever implementation efforts were ongoing were halted because SB 824 was enjoined by the Court of Appeals. Do you remember when that happened?
Exactly. But
do you remember that it was halted?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
We stopped offering ID printing services then.
And at that point, basically the implementation of the voter ID law halts entirely, right?
Yes, I think so.
And so the law wasn't in effect for the March 2020 primary election, right?
Right.
And I know you testified on direct that you were on the board for 3 different elections. And isn't it true that for none of those 3 elections had voter ID, did they?
No.
So the only implementation of a voter ID law that you've been personally involved in was halted before it was ever actually applied during an election.
Right. My only experience is with the effort to provide IDs at the Board of Elections office.
And you weren't on the board in 2016, right?
I was not.
All right. And are you aware that that's the last election in this state where there was a voter ID law in effect?
That was the primary in 2016, if I remember correctly.
Yes, you're exactly right. March primary, right?
Yes.
All right. And so you weren't involved in the implementation of that particular voter ID law back in March of 2016, were you?
I was not on the board at that time, no.
Now, during your direct examination, you were talking about the ability of voters to get voter IDs from the county board and the ability of the board to issue free voter IDs. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
And you would agree with me that if the demand for free voter IDs is really high, it's going to require more resources than if the demand for voter IDs is very low.
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. And maybe it's easier if I break it up, but if the demand for voter IDs is really big, that's going to take more resources, right?
Yes.
And conversely, if the demand is very small, it's going to take less resources, right?
Yes.
And you've not done any particular research into who in your county lacks acceptable ID for voting, have you?
I do not know that, no.
So you don't know who those voters are?
Specific to my county, I do not.
And you don't know what types of IDs they might hold or not hold, right?
Voters?
Correct.
I think it would, I'm sure, for instance, driver's license are a form of photo ID that many people have.
One indicator about whether the demand would be high or low for these free IDs might be how much demand there was during the last election that had voter ID. Would you agree with that?
Well, it was a new law, so I would think that it would take more than one primary to know for sure, but that would be the beginning of an indication, yes.
And I guess maybe to phrase it more precisely, if we could know the number of Alamance County voters that lacked appropriate ID during the 2016 primary, that might be a data point that could suggest how high the demand might be in the future.
I think that would be the beginning of figuring that out. Primaries are, especially non-presidential primaries, are pretty generally lower in participation in the election, and primaries in general are lower than the rate than the general election. So, usually when we're trying to determine things at the Board of Elections for how much something is going to be used, such as an early voting site, we would take into account, a full 4-year election cycle. But if the only data you have is from one primary and a congressional election, well, I guess that was a presidential election, so that would be the beginning of determining that, yes.
And have you done that math at all or crunched those numbers?
From 2016?
Yes.
I was not on the board, so I at that time would not have been as dedicated to knowing. So no.
Okay, I'd like to show you the first of a few exhibits that I'd like to look at with you today. I'm going to describe it before I put it, before I publish it. It's been marked for identification as LX0224. It is a printout from the State Board of Elections website, and it is entitled March 15, 2016 Official Primary Election Results Alamance. And I'd like to publish that at this time.
Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Huff has already established that Mr. Reed does not have personal knowledge of this information.
Well, give me just 1 second. I tell you what, Mr. Huff, what's the purpose of your? Are you attempting to impeach the witness? Or are you?
I'm happy to make a proffer, Your Honor. The witness has testified about concerns he has about the ability of the board to issue voter IDs, and he's just told me that the amount of demand for voter IDs has an impact on resources and how much resources the board would have to outlay. And then he told me that one way that you might, one indicator of that demand might be what happened in 2016. And so this exhibit is the beginning of what happened in 2016, because it relates, I guess, to use the words of the rule, it has some tendency to make the fact of demand, which is a fact, a material fact, it has a tendency to make that fact more or less probable. And so we would offer that it is appropriate and relevant, and it's within the scope of his testimony.
So
Your Honor,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
if I may be heard briefly, Mr. Huff is asking Mr. Reed to speculate about what might happen in the future based on past facts that he has already testified that he does not have personal knowledge of. And, he's not an expert witness, he's a lay witness. And I believe under the rules, as a lay witness, he can only testify to matters within his personal knowledge. And I don't believe this falls within that category.
And Your Honor, if I may be heard one more time, just with the court's indulgence, I mean, the witness's testimony is essentially that the board lacks the resources. And we intend to show through this exhibit and the next exhibit that the board has plenty of resources because the demand is going to be very small. Now, I won't pretend to tell the court or anybody else how much weight to afford to this particular exhibit, but it's undeniable that it goes to that fact, and it's undeniable that that's part of Mr. Reed's testimony, and it's the opinion that he's offered. In fact, it's the primary reason he was called, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection at this point, but I will allow you to make your proffer for the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. So may I proceed and question the witness about it?
You may. But again, this is just for the proffer for appellate purposes for the record.
Yes, Your
Honor. Generally speaking, I will just say that you'll have your chance to present evidence and to confront and present conflicting evidence for this witness, but I don't believe that this is an appropriate way for you to get your evidence in, but that's the reason basically for the sustaining of the objection, but I will allow you to make your proffer.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, sir, I'd like you to take a look at this exhibit that's marked 224 or LX 224, and you see at the top that this provides data, or it's entitled Official Primary Election Results. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. And if you scroll down to the bottom, all the way to the bottom of this first page, almost there. There you go. You see how it's got a web address in the bottom left?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recognize that as an address of the State Board of Elections website?
I can't say for sure, but it appears to be, yes.
And ncsbe.gov is a State Board of Elections website, right?
Yes.
Now, if you go back up just a little bit, all right, pause there, please. It lists the number of ballots cast in that March 2016 primary, right?
Yes.
And what's that number of ballots that were cast in that primary?
33%.
Right, and it gives you a total there, right, of 31,618? Okay, so I want you to hold that number for a moment. We're just going to kind of set it to the side. All right, now I want to show you a summary exhibit. I'll describe it before I publish it, because I suspect there will be a similar objection. I want to show you exhibit LX191. It's a summary exhibit that was compiled from data on Joint Exhibit 798. That exhibit has been designated highly confidential and is a voluminous spreadsheet with provisional ballots. And so you can go ahead and publish that exhibit.
And Your Honor, I'm going to renew my objection. Again, this is information that Mr. Reed has already testified that he does not have personal knowledge of, and as a lay witness, as I said earlier, you know, this is outside the scope of his personal knowledge.
All right.
Your Honor, may I be heard, or do you want me to
Yes.
pause?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm drinking from a fire hose right now. Yes, you can be heard.
Okay. Essentially where this is going is this is going to show that the number of people in this county that had an ID related issue or lacked ID in the last election where there was a voter ID requirement is minuscule. And I believe that directly undercuts the witness's conclusion that the Board of Elections lacks sufficient resources to issue free voter IDs, because I believe this evidence shows that the number of people who will be demanding those IDs is minuscule. Again, I don't purport to suggest the weight, but it is relevant to that, and we would like to confront the witness with these facts that are inconsistent with the opinions he's offered about the county board's ability to meet the demand for free IDs in the future.
Okay.
Your Honor.
Let me just jump in. I think this falls sort of under the same ruling that I just made with respect to the last exhibit, and that is to say you'll have your chance to present evidence that is in conflict with this witness's testimony. But I do believe that attempting to impeach him with something that he's not familiar with and has no personal knowledge of is inappropriate. So I'm going to sustain the objection, but I will allow you to make your proffer of evidence for the record. Do you understand what I'm saying? I hope I'm trying to be as clear as I can about that.
Yes, we understand, Your Honor, and we'll we'll move forward.
Okay.
So, sir, I want to, again, in terms of a proffer, I just want to walk through this with you a little bit. The title on this document is Analysis of Provisional Ballots Cast in Alamance County in March 2016 Primary. Do you see that?
Are you speaking to me?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Mr. Reed, I'm talking to you now. Do you see the title there? Okay. So this document purports to show data about the March 2016 primary election provisional ballots. The number you had before from the previous exhibit was total votes cast. Are you with me so far?
I think so.
Okay. So in the universe of total votes cast, there's some percentage or some number of that were provisional ballots. And this document talks about those numbers. You with me so far?
I think so.
Okay. You can see there from line 1, it's got the number of provisional ballots cast during that election as 235. Were you aware that there were only 235 ballots, provisional ballots cast in the 2016 election?
Objection.
I was
Your Honor.
not on the board, so I would not have known that.
Pause just a second. The objection is sustained, but you need not object. All this information and all these questions, the objection has been sustained. I'm simply allowing Mr. Huff to make his proffer for the record.
Understood. Thank you, Your Honor.
And I'm going to move on from this quicker than I otherwise would have. I just am going to do enough so that it's clear for the record where we were headed, and then I won't burden the court any further with my proffer.
You're not burdening the court at all, and don't feel like you have to move along sooner than you otherwise would have. I want you to have full opportunity to make the record complete.
Thank you, Your Honor. And sir, were you aware, and now I'm talking to you, Mr. Reed, I know we're jumping around on you. Mr. Reed, were you aware that of the 235 provisional ballots that were cast in 2016 in the primary, only 146 of those were not counted?
Again, I was not on the board at that time, so I would not have known that.
And so we started out of the 31,000 plus ballots that were cast in the 2016 primary, only 146 of them were not counted. And I want to talk to you about those numbers and see what you know, if anything, about them. If you look there under number 2 on this exhibit 191, the sub A through sub H has information about these 146 provisional ballots that didn't count. And I'm not going to go through all of it with you, but I do want to direct your attention, and I want to ask you about 2B. Were you aware that of the 146 provisional ballots that were not counted in that election, there were only 17 that were not counted due to an ID-related reason? Did you know that?
I did not know that.
And so out of 31,000 voters in that election, there were only 17 that had a vote not count, had a provisional ballot not count for an ID-related reason. That suggests that the number of voters in Alamance County who lack ID is not substantial. Isn't that correct?
I guess I'm not comfortable with the term not substantial. I mean, for me as somebody administrating votes, elections, 17 people not getting to cast their vote is problematic. I also know from reports of election workers that, sometimes when people are offered provisional ballots, they just choose not to vote provisionally. Does this document people who were just chose not to vote provisionally?
Well, let's look at some of these. Let's look at some of these and see, kind of test your knowledge about some of these subcategories, and let's look at that 17. If you look down in there on, let's see, so we were in 2B, and if you look at, so 2B2, little Roman numeral 2, right? There you go. We're getting there for you. You see on the screen, she's highlighting that section. So 11 of the 17 had a driver's license number. And under SB 824, a driver's license is a valid form of identification for voting, isn't it?
Yes.
And if we factor out the 11 who had a driver's license number, that only leaves 6, doesn't it?
17 minus 11 is 6. Yes.
So out of 31,000 people who voted in the March 2016 primary, which is the last primary where there was a voter ID requirement, only 6 of them had a provisional ballot not count for an ID related reason. Are you following me so far?
I believe so.
All right. And did you know that?
I was not on the board in 2016, so I would not have known that.
6 voters is 0.02% of the total voting, of the total 32,000 or 31,000 voters, right?
Yes. May I ask a question?
Of course, sure.
How many cases of in-person voter fraud were documented in that election?
Well, sir, no one wants to hear me. No one wants to hear the lawyers testify. But my point is this: you had made the point, and you were concerned about the board's ability to service the demand for free ID. The fact that you now know that only 6 people had their vote not count out of 31,000 in the last election that had voter ID, doesn't that undermine your conclusion? Or
I mean, I'm not familiar with this document, but I will say that for 6 people to be disenfranchised is problematic to me. We basically make every effort we can for every voter we can to have their ballot counted. We go to great lengths to ensure that. So,
but certainly that number doesn't suggest to you there's going to be a massive demand for pre-voter IDs if this law is reinstated, does it?
I don't, as I said earlier on, one primary, the first time the requirement was made, seems to me to be not enough data to draw large conclusions.
Okay, and we can take the exhibit down at this point. Well, sir, certainly your board has the ability to service 6 people who need IDs.
If that's the true number.
I mean, even if the number was 20 times that, you would agree with me that between now and the next election, your board staff could issue that number of free IDs, couldn't they?
I guess my concern would be, what kind of coverage we would have throughout the county to provide that service.
But from just setting aside where it would happen, just from a manpower perspective, you would agree with me that your staff could pump out 120 IDs between now and the next election, couldn't it?
If those people came to the office requesting an ID in that number, I suppose so.
Now, if any of these people who lack ID, right? Let's say that there is these 6 voters, and let's say they're still out there. Any of them who lack ID.
Now, is that also? I mean, that was one in that election. You had 1/3 of registered voters voting. Is that right?
Yeah. Again.
And then that does not include unregistered voters who might perhaps be voting same-day registration.
Yeah. Again, sir. No one wants to hear this lawyer's opinion on the record. So
I guess I'm just suggesting that there's a lot of unknowns that I'm not comfortable speculating on, especially without familiarity with the specific case.
So just to kind of review where we are now, if the 2016 data still leaves you with a question mark, and you haven't analyzed which voters in your county lack ID, right? We talked about that a few minutes ago. It seemed to me that you don't have a basis to predict just how high the demand will be for free IDs if this bill is enacted. Would you agree with me about that?
I don't have the data.
And so there's really no way for us to predict accurately whether the demand will be very high or very low, is there?
Not for me to predict.
Yeah. So if we were to, I'll leave that there.
Does that finish your proffer?
Oh, when I took the exhibit down, Your Honor, I was done proffering. And I'm sorry, I should have made that clear. But that moment is documented on the record when I took that thing down.
That's fine. I do think it's appropriate when you make a proffer to sort of let the record know. So, and also Ms. Bora would know. I need to, be on my toes here now.
Oh, that's yeah.
Object if I deem it necessary. So thank you for that.
Yes, my apologies, Your Honor. But yeah, I'm going to switch gears here. And I think we covered a little bit of this.
Sorry, if I may interject just briefly on the proffer piece. My objection to speculation would extend to any questions that were post proffer that were unclear whether they were indeed post the taking down of the exhibit or not.
I will allow all that to constitute his proffer until I asked him whether or not his proffer was over. So I'll sustain all those questions and just allow those questions and answers to be part of the record for purposes of preserving the record and for purposes of him establishing his proffer.
Thank you, Your Honor.
From this point forward, going forward, object if you think that it's an improper question.
Thank you.
And Mr. Huff, to the extent that prejudices you, if you think there's a question in there that should not have been part of the proffer, then ask it again, and we'll see whether or not there's an objection, and I'll rule on it. Okay.
Yes, Your Honor, and that's, you kind of read my mind. You might have seen me flipping backwards in my pages, and so Mr. Reed, again, this is my mistake, and I apologize. I have to ask you a couple of these again. And so one of the ones that we just covered is you testified that you hadn't researched who the voters are in Alamance County who lack qualifying ID to vote, right?
Not specifically in Alamance County. I mean, I would I feel like I would have a sense of generally who does not, who may or may not have IDs, but in terms of demographic clarity, no.
And you and I reviewed, or you would agree with me that let me start over. If I understand your testimony, it's that you have concerns about the extent to which 2016 informs the demand for IDs in the future, right?
I do have concerns about that, yes.
So if we've not looked at the voters in Alamance County who lack ID, and you've not done that research, and you're uncomfortable extrapolating from what happened in 2016, then that leaves us without a basis to predict whether the demand for voter ID in the future will be very high or very low, doesn't it?
Yes. We lack statistical evidence that I feel like is substantial to make projections.
So then it's possible that the demand in the future will be very small, isn't it?
Well, you just said we would have no way of knowing that.
Right, and my question now is it's possible that it'll be very small, right?
Again, as we've said, do not have the information to generalize.
Let's talk a little bit about the current capabilities of the board. You currently have a printer for voter IDs, right?
I assume we still have the machine that we had. I believe that it's in storage. I can't say for sure.
And you've got staff that are trained on how to print IDs using that printer, right?
We had staff use the ID machine, yes.
And the board owns computers, right?
The board owns computers, yes.
So you currently have the ability to produce these free IDs.
I would assume that we have the same capability that we had when the ID requirement was in effect.
And the machine that the board has, the county board has, that printer, you all didn't have to pay for that machine, did you?
I don't believe so.
That came from the state board of elections, right?
If my memory serves me, yes.
And your staff members who are trained, there are 6 of those, right?
I'm not sure how many staff members were trained on the machine. We had it for such a brief period of time. So I could not say what number of staff members were trained on the machine.
Am I in the right ballpark?
What was your ballpark?
6.
I don't know if every staff member was trained.
Was it more than 3?
I could not say for sure.
And when a member of the public wanted an ID back when you were still issuing them, they would go into your lobby and you would have multiple staff members there behind the glass ready to print an ID for the voter.
Usually we have 2 people at the desk who presumably could do that, fulfill that responsibility.
And you don't know much about the training that those 2 people received, do you?
I don't.
So you don't know how time intensive that training was?
I don't.
And you don't know how
it was such a brief period of time that my impression is the processes were almost experimental.
So you don't know what resources would go into training more staff, do you?
I would assume that the complexity of the machine is not overwhelming.
And you don't have a way to know whether the State Board of Elections will give your board additional machines in the future, do you?
I have no way of knowing that.
And I keep using the word, or I've used a couple times the word machine, but what we're talking about essentially looks like a printer, doesn't it?
Going back to your previous question, I mean, were you suggesting that we would have multiple machines in the same lobby?
Well, my question to you was, do you have any way of predicting whether a year from now the state board will decide to give you enough of these printers to put one at every early voting site?
I, of course, have no way of knowing that. I would be concerned about staffing early voting site ID machines. Typically, the computer setup is limited at, well, definitely the early voting sites do not have the computer capability and the record checking capability that the office has.
Right, but my question to you was much simpler, and I want to make sure you understood my question. It was just whether you have a way to predict whether the board's going to give you, or whether the state board's going to give your board a bunch of free voter ID printers in the future.
I cannot tell the future.
And similarly, you don't know whether the General Assembly is going to appropriate funding for additional voter ID training, do you?
I would not be able to know that.
And similarly, there's no way to know whether there would be additional funding in the future for additional staff, to the extent you even need additional staff to run these printers, right?
When the state has made mandates in the past, such as mandating early voting hours, we have not received extra staff for those needs. So while I have no way of telling the future, I would not have a lot of confidence that resources would necessarily be provided.
And back when you were still issuing these IDs at your county board, I think you testified, and correct me if I have the wrong title, but it was the chair of your board requested one of these IDs. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you were, I think you said that you were in the building when that ID was printed, weren't you?
I can't say for sure. We were in a board meeting, and our chair had not entered the boardroom. If memory serves me, he was attempting to get an ID at that time. I don't have a lot of confidence in my exact recollection of that, what somebody was doing in a room that I was not in, but I do clearly remember that he had one made and had great curiosity about it.
And that process took about 15 minutes, didn't it?
I can't say for sure. I don't know how long he got there, or before I did, or yeah, I don't know that. I will say that I am unfamiliar with the operation of the machine.
You recall that you sat for a deposition in this case, right?
I recall that, yes.
And you gave testimony under oath that day, didn't you?
I did.
And that was in 2019, right?
I believe so.
And so it may have been that your memory was fresher in 2019 than it is as we sit here today in 2021, right?
I would imagine.
Do you recall being asked, quote, how about the voter ID? Do you recall being asked, quote, how long did that take? And that your answer was, quote, 15 minutes?
Mr.
I don't
Huff,
recall.
could you just point me to the page of the,
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to put that up. So that's on page, thank you. So we're on page 41. And looking at lines, since we're going to do the context, let's look at lines 4 to 9. Okay, yeah, she's got it there. So Mr. Reed, before I ask you a couple questions about it, I'll give you a second to just look at it. Have you had a chance to look at that highlighted section?
Okay.
Okay. So it took about 15 minutes, didn't it?
Apparently from my deposition.
Okay, you can take the transcript down. Now, we talked a little bit about early voting sites. You started talking about it in response to one of my other questions, but there's a couple things I want to clarify about them. When during early voting, you put staff at early voting sites, right?
Part-time staff, yes. We hire
Okay.
we hire that. Those are for the election season. That staff is hired, yes.
And there's some amount of equipment that is at those early voting sites while they're in operation, right?
Yes,
Things like desks,
they have desks, yes.
chairs.
They have office supplies.
Okay. Electricity, computers, all that stuff.
Yes.
And during early voting, the hours are expanded beyond normal business hours, right?
Yes.
And they also include some weekend hours, don't they?
It does, yes. The last Saturday before the election is mandated, and we try to offer more.
And on that day, you've also got staff in the county board office, right?
Yes.
I'll talk to you a little bit about funding. Do you know how much was appropriated for elections in Alamance County in the 2018-2019 fiscal year?
I do not call specifically. I know for the presidential year that just passed, well, it's hard to say because of COVID expenses, but if I had to estimate, I would say $600,000, $700,000, somewhere in that range.
Does 861,657 sound right to you?
That's budgeted or spent?
appropriate, it actually approved, adopted budget from the county?
That was for a federal election year. That sounds like a reasonable, that makes sense to me, yes.
And do you know whether your board actually spent all of that money that it was appropriated that year?
I know it is our habit to try not to. I can't remember exactly for sure, but it's easy for me to think that we and then we also spend money out of grants. So the math gets a little complicated in there, but.
So even beyond the appropriation, you have other sources of funding that you can draw on to meet election requirements?
Grant money, I believe, is usually not spent on essentials, but on specific unique expenditures. I guess I'm drawing on my experience here in the last year with all of the added COVID expenses. So.
All right, so that was 18-19. Let me ask you about 2020-21, the 2020 and 2021 fiscal year. Do you know whether your funding from the county went up from the 2018-2019 levels or went down?
So a presidential election year is always a more expensive budget year. And again, as I said, with COVID expenditures as a sort of unique situation, I would imagine, I feel safe to say that a presidential election year in a pandemic was a lot more expensive than the previous year.
Do you know that, or are you assuming that because you know it was a presidential year?
I think our budget for the previous year was $1,300,000.
Right, but my question was, do you know, or are you assuming?
I'm pretty sure that our budget last year was, it varied widely. We were very concerned about, the county was very concerned about funding, tax funding in a year when there was so much economic and uncertainty. We had our initial budget request for the Board of Elections was the recommended budget from the county manager would have cut our budget by over 50%. It gets a little complicated. We ended up using grant money that had been set aside that was then added to that. So pre-COVID grant money. I think our budget then got up to closer to $1 million when some of the money was restored to the budget from the county manager's recommended budget. And then I did not keep up with with all of the federal and state grant money that came in. But I believe, if I remember, because our last meeting was a proposed budget meeting by our staff, that last year's budget was in the end around, like I said, $1,300,000.
Okay, so to make sure I'm following you, you think that in 1920, that in that fiscal year that you received more appropriated budget than you did in 18-19?
I believe so.
Okay, and in What about in the 2020, 2021 fiscal year, right? The most current one. Did it go up again? Do you know?
It did not. I do not believe that it went up again. We will be conducting municipals, but also primaries. So I think we have the potential of conducting 4 elections if there are runoffs. But again, we usually compare our budgets based on if they are federal, presidential, or municipal years. So the most accurate way of comparing the expenses of an election to an election would be to make sure you were comparing to the same type of election, which is on 2 and 4 year cycles.
So you don't know the number for the 2020, 2021 fiscal year, right?
I do not recall.
And certainly you don't have a way to know what the appropriation will be in future fiscal years, right?
I cannot tell the future, no.
Or I know that you've testified that there are other sources of funds as well. I think you call them grants. There's no way to know what those may or may not be in future elections, right?
I do not know what the future holds. I will say that as I've said, our for the time that I've been on the board, and according to our staff in previous years to that, we've basically been asked to keep expenses to have a 0 increase in budgets. For instance, staff compensation is something that has come up a lot. Alamance County has a lot of challenges with that. For instance, we've not raised the pay for our early voting workers since the position was created in the early 2000s. So, and it's another reason why we have our department within the county struggles with our pay for our staff for things such as career ladders that allow our employees to be compensated for achieving certain trainings, and so we are currently in a much undersized building than we would like to be. It was quite a effort to conduct a safe election process in our during the pandemic and the 2020 election. For instance, we have to keep elections equipment and storage in other areas, which is not in another building, which is unstaffed, and is we have security concerns about those sort of things. We can't drink the water in our Board of Elections office building. We have trouble with sewer lines. We had an overflow in the middle of the last election that people had to evacuate the building. So we definitely are on a multi-year long-term funding crunch in our administration of the elections. Another concern I always have is our advertising in terms of educating the public about new laws or new requirements for voting. I think, in the past, we've had $5,000 to $7,000 for all communications efforts. So,
excuse me, Mr. Reed, would it be okay if I asked a question?
thanks.
Okay. So I had asked you about whether or not you were able to predict what your funding sources in terms of these grants and other things would be in the future. And I just want to make sure your answer is no, right?
Yes, I cannot predict the future.
And so as you sit here in court today, you're not able to reliably predict what your financial resources will be for future elections. Isn't that correct?
My only insight would be to look at past funding and make my expectations on past funding.
Similar to how we were looking at the number of people in the past election that did not have qualifying ID for their provisional ballot process. You were making a similar sort of prediction with regard to funding.
Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Huff is conflating issues regarding Mr. Reed's lack of personal knowledge with respect to things that happened in 2016 versus issues related to the budget, which he is aware of here.
I would say that, so, go ahead.
Your Honor, I don't wish to be heard. I don't have another question along that line. So I'm just pausing.
I guess my response would be that.
Let me just stop you there. When there's an objection, Mr. Reed, just wait on me to rule on it before you answer. So the objection is sustained. But if you want to make a proffer, you can.
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
But thank you for offering. So, sir, you're strike that, please. During your time on the board, have you found it, is it kind of one of your goals as a board to ensure that the elections that happen in Alamance County under your watch are legitimate elections?
Oh, yes, it's our top priority.
And as part of that, does voter participation play a role in ensuring the legitimacy of the elections in your county?
Yes, that's always a concern.
And you would agree with me that voter confidence directly affects voter participation, right?
I agree.
And so is voter confidence also one of the things that's important to you as a member of the Alamance County Board of Elections?
I agree.
What about the requirement that voters have to register before they can cast a vote? In your experience, does that requirement play a part in ensuring the legitimacy of elections in Alamance County?
Yes.
And is that an important requirement in your opinion?
For voters to register before they vote?
Yes.
Yes.
And you agree that only registered voters should be allowed to vote?
Yes, if they're not registered, you would not know where they live. And in order to vote in the right ballot, that you would need to know someone's place of residence.
And you believe that even though it requires effort on the part of a would-be voter to get themselves registered, right?
Yes, same-day registration makes that process a lot more convenient for the voter if they have seeking to vote but have not yet registered.
And is the same true for voters, even those voters that live in the rural parts of Alamance County?
Be registered before they vote?
Yes.
Yes, it's important that they be registered before they vote.
Well, and you were testifying about how, I had asked you whether you still believed in registration or words to that effect, even though it required some effort on the part of would-be voters. You remember that?
Just a few minutes ago?
Yeah.
I remember that question, yes.
And you were talking to me about how it was okay because voters could do one-stop registration. I may not have used the exact term, but you recall the testimony I'm referring to, right?
I believe so, yes.
And that convenience is available to all voters in Alamance County, isn't it?
Same day registration at a one-stop site?
Yes.
Yes, any person who otherwise qualifies as a voter can take advantage of same day registration.
And in your opinion, that's not overly burdensome to those voters, is it?
Same day registration is, I believe it's a benefit.
Okay, and that's true for voters in Haw River, right?
Yes, our ability to offer early voting sites, for instance, for the upcoming municipal elections, we'll only have one early voting site in Graham, even though we've got, I believe, 7 municipalities around the county. Everyone has to go to Graham to early vote in municipal elections. So if ideally we would have the resources to have early voting sites in the municipalities that are conducting elections.
But my question was getting at whether or not the convenience, or I guess let me ask you this way. I mean, you've told me that you believe in the importance of registration, and that it's not too much to ask of voters to have to register, right?
Yeah, you need to. It needs to be confirmed where you live, and if you're of age,
And you believe that for all the voters in your county, don't you?
that every voter be registered before they vote.
That it's not too much to ask to have to register before you vote. You believe that applies to every voter in your county, don't you?
Yes, I believe that registration should be as available as possible to make that as convenient to as many voters as possible. Same day registration makes available at early voting makes that possible. I would like to expand. I would hope that the Board of Elections can expand early voting options throughout the county, and expand on weekends when many people want to vote. So I always am seeking more availability for registration opportunities.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about your staff, and the board on which you serve. Before you, or when you were first appointed, you had to take an oath to serve on the County Board of Elections, didn't you?
I did.
To uphold the Constitution of North Carolina?
Yes.
And you take that oath quite seriously, don't you?
I do.
And is it your experience that your fellow board members do the same?
I'm confident that we do.
And if SB 824 goes into effect, that's not going to change. You're still going to uphold your oath, right?
Certainly.
And the same is true for your fellow board members.
I believe so.
And so if 824 goes into effect, you'll carry out your duties in good faith.
Yes, I will make every effort to fill all the legal requirements to help voters fulfill all the legal requirements to have a chance to vote.
And you believe that your fellow board members will do the same, right?
Make every effort available to us. Yes.
And the same is true for your staff, right?
Yes, we have a very dedicated staff.
And I think on direct, I jotted down that you said at one point, we love our election workers. So it sounds like the same would apply to your election workers too, right?
What would apply?
That they would do everything in their power to fulfill their duties in good faith.
Yes, I have confidence.
And I think you said that one of the things you do as a member of the board is you participate in ruling on provisional ballots. Am I right about that?
That's true.
And so certainly, if SB 824 goes into effect, you would continue to carry out that duty in good faith, right? And you personally would never vote to reject a provisional ballot on the basis of somebody's race, would you?
Certainly not.
And sounds like you don't think any of your fellow board members would do anything like that, do you?
Certainly not.
And you wouldn't, as a member of the board, you wouldn't tolerate your staff treating voters differently on account of the race of the voter, would you?
Certainly not.
Might be a good time for me to interrupt. It's 3:30, time for our afternoon break. We're going to take about a 15-minute break at this time. We'll see you all back here at 3:45.